Yeah, is cycle. Today is all about food. We're talking about we'd like to get some is work. Regulations. Craig's going to talk about some tax questions, and then we're going to talk about the other aspects as well. I'm going to just stick onto my iPad on so that we can monitor it. And if you've got any questions, then post them up on the questions, and we'll go from there. So as I said before, this is phase 2 startup of the business legal lifecycle. And so that's a copy of the business legal lifecycle. So the talking points today, government regulation is number 1. Tax, as Craig's going to talk about that. Grants and funding I'm going to talk about, and then Craig's going to talk about directors' responsibilities. So government regulation, what are we talking about here? Well, what we're talking about is what the government put in place to regulate businesses. So the first one is if you go and buy a widget from a business and that widget doesn't do what it's supposed to do, then and the person who sold you that widget knew that it wouldn't do that, then that's misleading and deceptive conduct. That's a big thing with banks and other professional services who don't provide what they say that they're going to provide. So misleading and deceptive conduct is a tricky one. It's one that you need to be aware of in business, because if you're not, then you can end up causing yourself a lot of grief. The second one is food standards. So what are we talking about here? Over the years, I've acted for a lot of restaurants and a lot of businesses that produce food for a living. And food standards, they apply across all manner of and different types of businesses. But food standards are the things that, basically the common sense things in a business to make it show that they're right to run their business. So a classic example, I won't name any names because don't want to get in trouble from releasing any confidential information. But if you've got a restaurant, and they're often published in the paper at the end of the year, that maybe didn't have a clean premises, so there's a cockroach running through the premises, then there's a reason for that occurring. Now, often that reason might be that they didn't clean up the premises properly, they didn't get rid of holes that might have been in walls that vermin got through. There's many different reasons, but there are food standards, they are in place, and there's something that's very important, and there's heavy fines, especially in Queensland. There's heavy fines for businesses that don't get their food standards right. Next on the list are Australian standards. So again, countries around the world have different standards, but in Australia we have the Australian standards. And what they are is a set of standards, minimum rules that govern businesses and what they need to do in their businesses. Businesses can also apply to get Australian standards, and what they are standards that will be used to govern their business. So the classic one is ISO 9001, which is a quality standard for the business and what you're doing in business. So Australian standards, pretty important, something that you can get in place and work quite well. The next one that I want to spend a bit of time on is code of practice. And codes of practice are all about the government putting some regulations in place for businesses. So the classic one is the Franchising Code of Conduct. The Franchising Code of Conduct regulates what franchisors and franchisees can do with each other and what disclosure has to go between franchisors and franchisees in different types of businesses. So with the Code of Practice, it's a legally binding document, it's adopted by the government, and it will say what needs to happen for the business from a legal point of view. So that can be many different things and many different ways of looking at it, but a Code of Practice, pretty important that you understand. So to give you an example, we have a client who, and again, we won't name any names, but he ran a franchise business which sold coffee machines. The Code of Practice required that if something happened and he got sued, that he had to disclose the fact that he got sued on different government forms that had to be provided to franchisees at different times. He didn't do that. So what could happen is people could come after him for not disclosing the right things under the franchising code. They also, the franchising code is a great example, because a franchisor, when you go to enter a franchise, has to have a certain level of disclosure on different things to do with the franchise. And that came about because there were lots of franchises over the years that didn't disclose pertinent information to franchisees, and that caused a lot of problems. So the codes of practice are there for a reason, and it's a good idea to follow them. There's many other ones. Anyway, I'll hand over to Craig. Craig, I don't know whether you can see the slides using the Skype TV here, but I can guide you through the tax slides. Do you want to go through those?
I can't see the slides, but in terms of tax, obviously it's an obligation that you can't not do. Paying tax is an important part of business, and it's unavoidable, unfortunately. So there's a variety of taxes. The sort of three main ones we want to talk about today are company tax, GST, and income tax. There's also payroll tax, depending on how many employees you might have. There's fringe benefit taxes and other taxes you need to be aware of. But in terms of company tax, so obviously you need to lodge your returns, and then there'll be the tax that's payable. This is provided you've set up as a company. As per the tips that we gave on Monday's Fast Fix, provisioning for your company tax throughout the year is something that you obviously need to do. You don't want to be left at the end of the year, you lodge your tax return, and all of a sudden you've got to pay all this tax and you don't have any money to do it. So, there are ways, and talk to your accountant about extending that out, but provisioning for it is obviously a good idea. Depending on how much you're paying, you might have to go on an instalment where you pay it throughout the year as well if you get up to a certain level. So talk to your accountant about those sorts of things. There are ways of making it so cash flow, helps cash flow, those sorts of things. But be aware that you're obviously going to have to pay company tax. You can't avoid it. The other big one, if it applies to your particular business, is GST. So we all know that's 10%. And the way it works in terms of a business point of view is you're collecting GST on behalf of the government. So any goods or services that you sell, provided it's not GST exempt, of course, you're collecting your 10%. Anything, and then you lodge normally quarterly, or you could do it at different times, is what's called your business activity statement, so your BAS. And that calculates how much GST you've collected, and it also calculates how much GST you've paid out. And so the way it works is the difference between the two is what you have to remit to the tax office for your GST. Again, great to get all the money in. You're getting 10% more of what your goods are worth or what your service is worth, but that 10% has to go back to the government at some point. So again, provision for those for the GST. In a perfect world, every single time you get paid something, you take 10% and put that in a bank account. Whether you could do that, for everything, questionable. But if you could do that, obviously that'd be the perfect situation. You always have the money there, and you can just transfer it once the BAS comes in. But if you can't, do it all, at least provision for some of it, and take that into account for cash flow and your budgets, which we've spoken about on Monday as well. Make sure you budget for all these things. Because it can be a bit nasty if it all of a sudden pops up. So it's a quarterly obligation, and you can't avoid not paying it. So that sort of flows into income tax as well. So at the last month of each quarter, as part of your BAS normally is your PAYG for your employees. So a month's worth of PAYG. So your BAS will be your difference between the GST collected, the GST that you've paid, and a month's of PAYG for your employees. Again, when you're paying your employees, obviously they're not receiving the tax, you are keeping that, and then you need to give that to the tax office. So again, each week or fortnight or whatever it is, payment cycle that you've got for your employees, you're transferring that money or keeping it quarantined somewhere, so you've got that money for your PAYG that you need to pay. And when it's a month that's not in the last month of the quarter, then you're paying your PAYG monthly normally to the tax office. So which is a good thing, so it doesn't get too far out of control. So it's, depending on how many employees you've got, of course, you're always transferring that to the tax office every month or so. So again, don't just pay your employees and then just basically spend the tax. You need to provision for all these sorts of things and make sure you've got it in a separate account or some way of keeping it separate. So they're the sort of main taxes for a business that we see. That was it for me, Jeremy. Moving on to grants and funding.
Great, yeah. So grants and funding. So what are we talking about here? We're talking about the types of grants and funding that you can get from the government. So a lot of businesses don't realise that there can be a bit of a pile of money that the government will give you to operate your business. Now, there are many different types of grants, many different types of funding that you can get. The first person that you should speak to is a grants advisor. So a grants advisor is a specialist who deals in grants and knows all the grants. So there are literally hundreds of grants out there. They change all the time. So what you need to do is talk to someone who knows what they're talking about. So grants advisors, they're really good for that. So I'll give you an example. We had a client who was looking to start a business that was going to be involved in the solar industry. I won't give too much information, but it was going to be involved in the solar industry. And at the time, there were lots of different benefits and grants that were available to them to operate their business. So they didn't know what to do. They came to me. I didn't know what to do. So we spoke to our grants advisor, who was able to advise them on all sorts of different grants that they were able to get. So grants advisors are very important people. They can really help you get the most out of what you can actually get from the government, whether that be state or federal in Australia. And so grants advisors, that's what they do. There's also specific funding bodies. So what do we mean by that? So there are certain industry bodies that are set up and certain other bodies that will provide funding to start up businesses. So that might be government departments, it might be other industry bodies that will actually provide funding to businesses for the startup of their business. They're pretty important, and they're pretty. If you can get a hold of one, they're very good, and they help out the business a lot. So specific funding bodies are pretty crucial if you've got the right kind of body. Now, once again, it's a bit of a needle in a haystack of how to find those kind of people. But what I'd suggest is that you speak to a grants advisor, or even speak to the government. They often have people there that can actually help you find those right people. So grants advisors and specific funding bodies are a great source for getting information about grants and that you can get in their business. So that's it from me on that. Over to Craig for director's responsibilities.
Alright, so director's responsibility. So as a director, it'd be great if there wasn't any responsibility, but unfortunately there is. Most of these are pretty self-explanatory, really. There's a number of them under the Corporations Act that I'll go through, and I'll leave the last one, the one that's probably one that everyone sort of talks about, to the end, because it's probably the more complicated of the 9 or so, or 8 duties I want to talk about. So the first one is the duty to act in good faith in the interests of the company as a whole. So again, pretty self-explanatory. As a director, you're acting in good faith in the interests of the company. So not for yourself, not for you, John, not for you, Billy, for the company. So whenever you're making decisions, it's in the best interests of the company, not yourself. So as I said, pretty self-explanatory from that point of view. The same goes for duty not to act for an improper purpose. So obviously any decisions you make or any actions that you do as a director, it's not to be for an improper purpose. So it's got to be for a proper purpose, and it's got to be in the best interests of the company, flowing on from the good faith. So anything that you do is for the company, because you're the director of the company. You're not acting in your own personal capacity, and any decisions you make are not to be for your own. So as I said, the first two are pretty self-explanatory. The next one is duties of care and diligence. So that's the test for that is what a reasonable person might expect someone to do as a director in terms of making decisions. So the idea of it is, of course, that directors, to avoid risky transactions. But in saying that, entrepreneurial spirit and those sorts of things, if a director wants to, and a company wants to go down a particular path and it's risky, that doesn't necessarily mean that they've breached their duty of care and diligence. So as part of that, there's what's called the business judgment rule that goes into it. And you've got to, again, it goes back to the first duty that the decision that's been made is in good faith of the company. There's no personal interest that's been gained by the directors, and it's in the best interest of the company. So the Corporation Act recognises that just because you're making a sort of a riskier decision, it doesn't necessarily mean that you breach your duty. You're doing that as part of your business. So it could be that you're investing in a particular thing or whatever it is. But if you just blindly make a decision that's risky, you don't really look into it much at all, it's not really in the best interest of the company, or there's a personal interest that the director may be receiving or something along those lines, then it'll probably fail the business judgment rule, and then potentially you would fail under the test of the duty of care and diligence. So it's not to stop directors going out there and trying to make a buck. It's to stop bad decisions and not really looking into it. So that's the duty of care and diligence. The duty to avoid conflicts of interest is the next one. Again, pretty self-explanatory. If there is a conflict of interest between a director in a different capacity and the company, then they can be disclosed, and the company can then make a decision based on that disclosure of the conflict. But wherever there is one, then to hide behind that and proceed. And then if it's found out, then you've definitely breached the duty to avoid a conflict of interest. So with anything, common sense, and disclose if there is a particular interest, and then there can be an informed decision about whether or not you go down that path. So the obvious one is, of course, you might be entering into a new supplier agreement, and the director has an interest in that other company, and if that's not disclosed, then you can see why that potentially would be a breach of a duty, because they're getting a benefit from a contract. The next one is duty to not make improper use of the position of the director, and that's similar to the previous conflict of interest one, where the director gains a benefit in their personal interest, or a third party gains a benefit. So it could be someone that the director knows, and they're using their position as a director to enter into an agreement, for instance, with someone that's gaining a benefit that, one, hasn't been disclosed, and two, is solely because of the director is improperly using their position as a director.
Can I just interrupt there, Craig? Craig, can I just interrupt and give an example there? A recent one where a client, I think it comes up a bit with this one with companies that are going down, and where there's a dispute and directors start to try and go and do their own business. And so what do you think about a director who's been given an offer to go and engage in a business that hasn't been, the offer's really made to their company, but they go and do it individually, basically because they're having a dispute with their business owner?
Yeah, well, that potentially fall foul of the director's duties, wouldn't it? Because they're gaining a benefit for themselves rather than for the actual company, and the company's essentially missing out of a contract.
Yeah, absolutely.
In that sense. So yeah, and as I said, it's all pretty common sense type stuff. I think that you're, as a director, that it's an important role and you're part of the company. The last three, so we've got duty to not disclose confidential information. So obviously as a director, you're going to receive confidential information regarding the company's processes or whatever it might be, or a client list or something. They can't be disclosed for the benefit of the director, or disclosed in any event under confidentiality. So if you go around disclosing information to a third party or someone that you're going to get a benefit from, then you're going to be in breach of that particular duty. And that flows directly into duty not to make improper use of information. So any information that you gain while you're a director, you cannot then make use of that by, similar to Jeremy's example before, setting up shop somewhere else in a competing business, and I'm just going to use all that information that I gained while I was a director, and happy days, I'm heading off now. So you can see why that would be in breach of a director's duty, because you've gained information as a director and now you're using it improperly for your benefit or a third party's benefit, not for the company. So they're the main duties. And then the last one, which is probably the one that most people talk about, is the duty not to trade whilst insolvent. So to be insolvent, the test is that the company is unable to pay their debts as and when they fall due. And yes, those sorts of things. If there's the paper goes away, the main company that's where the director